We begin today's show with an explosive story of two Chicago police officers who blew the whistle on a gang of their colleagues after they discovered they were demanding bribes from drug dealers in the housing projects of Chicago, arresting their rivals and blocking any internal investigations into their actions. The two whistleblowers, Shannon Spaulding and her partner, Danny Echeverria, spent 5 years working with the Chicago Police Department and the FBI in their case, only to be sidelined, outed as informants, threatened, and eventually forced out of the police department. In contrast, the named senior officials and cops who helped cover for their fellow officers were able to retire from the force with their pensions intact and face no punishment for their role in the cover-up. Spaulding says she has even received death threats. She and her partner both took stress-related medical leaves, and she's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Their ordeal is chronicled in a 4-part investigation published by The Intercept called The Code of Silence. Part 1 is headlined, "In the Chicago Police Department, if the bosses say it didn't happen, it didn't happen." It's written by the award-winning Chicago journalist Jamie Calvin, who's made a career of exposing police misconduct in Chicago. He spent 3 years interviewing Spaulding for the report. He's also known for uncovering the autopsy report that showed Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times by Chicago police in 2004. And was the first to report on the existence of the video of the shooting, which was released 400 days after McDonald was killed. Thursday marked the 2nd anniversary of the killing. Calvin is now working with Spaulding on a project called the Invisible Institute, which has set up an encrypted Dropbox for Chicago police officers to anonymously upload evidence of corruption. They also offer to link whistleblowing cops to mental health and legal resources. For more, we go to Chicago, where Jamie Calvin joins us to discuss the investigation. And we're joined by the whistleblower at the center of his story, Shannon Spaulding. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Jamie, let's begin with you. Lay out this story.
So this is really a Serpico saga for our time of two narcotics officers who undercover a massive criminal enterprise, as your setup said, in high-rise public housing in Chicago during its last decade of existence. It's all been demolished now. So the scene of the crime has essentially disappeared. They make conscientious efforts to bring this criminal activity to the attention of their superiors. They're blown off, ultimately go to the FBI and provide information. It's not conclusive information, but grounds for investigation. They then are detailed to work undercover with the FBI and pursue this investigation for a number of years, are at the point of breaking the case wide open when they are outed within the department and have since suffered constant retaliation. I think part of what is really important about this story is what it illustrates about the nature of the Code of Silence. You know, I think the common understanding of the Code of Silence is it's a kind of peer-to-peer phenomena of the rank and file. We're in the foxhole together. You've got my back. I've got mine. Nobody likes a tattletale. There certainly is that dimension within police culture. But what's so striking about this story is that the retaliation against these officers is ordered by high-ranking supervisory officials within the department. So it's really a story in great detail of how the Code of Silence operates at the center of the Chicago Police Department.
Well, Jamie, about this issue of retaliation being ordered at high levels, how was that documented in the lawsuit? And also, the city settled for $2 million before there was a trial. Could you talk about the tactic of the city of settling the suit?
Right. So there was in the midst of this ordeal, the two officers, Shannon and Danny, brought a whistleblower lawsuit, really an employment suit, hoping above all to be protected from further retaliation. It only compounded and intensified the retaliation at that point. There are a number of allegations in the lawsuit, and the Intercept piece links to all the underlying legal documents. But, you know, supervisors, the commander of narcotics, the chief of organized crime, made it clear that they did not want these officers working in units that they controlled. They went so far in one instance of really delivering a threat, and paradoxically, the threat was conveyed by the chief of internal affairs, who's charged with investigating this sort of thing, a threat against their personal safety. You know, I believe the quote was, if they call for backup, it's not coming. So, you know, this was not just a matter of being ostracized or shunned within the department, although it certainly was that. These, as Shannon says at one point in the article, I quote her saying, you know, we were officers without a department. So they're left out on the streets in this really dangerous investigation, investigating a team of officers who are thought to have been implicated in 2 murders. It hasn't been proven yet, but it's scarcely been investigated apart from Shannon and Danny's work. And they're kind of left wholly exposed. So, and this was coming from the top. This wasn't some kind of, you know, aberrant behavior. This is really the machinery of how the Chicago Police Department controls the narrative. Amy quoted the line about, you know, if 4 of the bosses say it didn't happen, it didn't happen. That's really what's at the center of this story.
Let's go to Shannon Spaulding, former Chicago police officer. On May 31st, Chicago agrees to settle a whistleblower lawsuit brought by Shannon Spaulding and her colleague Daniel Echeverria, who allege they suffered retaliation for reporting investigating criminal activity by fellow officers. Shannon Spaulding, tell us, what was it that you were investigating? When did it happen? And when did the cover-up, do you feel, and the retaliation against you start?
My partner Danny and I started investigating allegations that kept surfacing. There was a Sergeant, Ronald Watts, and members of his TAC team who worked directly underneath him that were imposing what they called on the street a Watts tax. Basically, he was extorting the drug dealers. He was receiving money from drug dealers that ran different drug lines within the Ida B. Wells housing projects in the surrounding area, and in exchange for that money, they were guaranteed protection from prosecution and arrest. In addition to that, the allegations were that this crew of rogue officers under the command of Ronald Watts were also planting narcotics on innocent individuals and falsifying police reports, falsely arresting them, putting them in prison for false allegations. There's also the allegations of, you know, physical violence, of being beaten if they didn't want to comply and pay this tax, as well as warrantless seizures, kicking in doors and going through people's apartments, stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. And the allegations kept being repeated over and over again from every individual that we would do intelligence debriefings with, along with our confidential informants. And I think you said, when did the retaliation begin on this investigation? We began to investigate it and brought it to the FBI in 2006. We were not officially assigned with our department to work with the FBI at that time. We were doing this on our own time. In 2007, we were assigned by the Chicago Police Department to work with the FBI solely on what was dubbed Operation Brass Tacks. Brass meaning the top officials in the police department. Brass refers to a boss. Tax, because that's what they were implementing on the drug dealers and the gangbangers. It was about, I believe it was 2010, August of 2010, when I realized that our identity had been compromised and that we were now out in the open. This was supposed to remain a strictly confidential investigation, and it was imperative that our identities not be revealed, because the targets of this investigation were officers and bosses, and we didn't know how far up the chain it would go, which meant that they had access to all of our personal information, where we lived, our children, anything that they wanted, which made us very vulnerable. So to expose our identity is basically throwing us to the wolves. These targets could now know who we are, what we're investigating, and you have to remember, these are police officers. They know what they did. And now they know we know. And that, with that comes the implication of federal prison time, losing your job, losing your livelihood. That makes us targets and makes it very dangerous for us to work.
Well, I want to turn to Janet Hanna, a 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department. She says she witnessed the harassment of you, Shannon, and your partner, Danny Echeverria. On one occasion, Hanna said she overheard a sergeant warning you about her own safety. This is Hanna telling NBC Chicago's Phil Rogers what she overheard.
That she better wear her bulletproof vest. She may go home in a casket, and he doesn't want to have to call her daughter and tell her that she's, she's gone.
And that was because she would be in danger from bad guys and they wouldn't protect her from the bad guys, or she'd be in danger from her fellow officers?
Both.
What about that? What kind of retaliation did you feel when you were still working there?
Oh, the retaliation was horrific. I actually felt so anxious walking into work every day because once I filed the whistleblower lawsuit, I am now working for the defendants of my lawsuit. So can you just imagine what that was like? I felt like I was walking into the lion's den with a stake around my neck every single day. And I recall that incident. That incident is just burned into my memory. It was my direct supervisor at the time within fugitive apprehension that was telling me that because we had investigated other officers, because we had basically broken the code of silence and we had gone against other sworn members, that the officers within that unit, the supervisor is relaying to me that the officers on the team and in this unit will not back you up. You're on your own. You're in a lot of danger. And he went so far as to saying, as to say, you're going to end up in a box, and I'm going to be the one knocking on the door and telling your daughter you're coming home in a box. And those were the type of threats that would happen just on a regular basis. It was almost, the retaliation was relentless, and it was daily.
I wanted to also ask Jamie Calvin, you've been investigating both police abuse and now this entire police corruption scandal. For those of us who've been following crime stories in police departments now for decades, this is almost like deja vu all over again. If it wasn't Serpico in the 1960s here in New York City, and then in the 90s there was a similar type of scandal with a corrupt group of officers named headed by a guy named Michael Dowd, and again a police officer within the department, Joe Tromboli, trying to ferret them out. But the Dowd criminal group was only revealed when Long Island police arrested him on charges. And it seems to me that there's always been sort of a link between corruption in police departments and abuse within police departments. That there seem to be upsurges in abuse at the same time that there are upsurges in corruption. I'm wondering your understanding what's been going on in Chicago.
Yeah, well, I think that's well put, and a huge part of that is the war on drugs and the way in which we've conducted it. I mean, I think we found consistently in multiple scandals that it happens in sort of specialized units working in supposedly combating the war on drugs, and but again and again, that proves to be a sort of setting and medium for corruption and all the attendant abuse. So what Shannon was describing was this sort of protection racket that hugely corrupt. The officers are really an integral part of the drug trade. At the same time, as part of that, they are daily, multiple times, violating the constitutional rights of citizens. False arrest, excessive force, the fabrication of evidence, on and on. So this all goes together, and I think we will continue to have recurring scandals of this nature until we can address the, we use this term, the code of silence, to describe a kind of culture within the department, a really mode of governance within the department. And until officers like Shannon and Danny are held up as models of good police officers and good police work, until the incentive-disincentive sort of scheme shifts, right now, for officers to break ranks and come forward and report really grievous abuse by fellow officers requires them to be heroic, almost to the point of self-sacrifice.
So
that can't work.
In February of 2015, the former Chicago Police Department Superintendent Gary McCarthy releases a statement to NBC Chicago saying, quote, Superintendent McCarthy and the CPD, Chicago Police Department, have zero tolerance for retaliation against whistleblowers. However, the city believes the claims of these particular plaintiffs are without merit. The city will continue to vigorously litigate this case. That was in February 2015. Shannon, the day you were going to trial, right, in May of 2016, they settled with you and Danny, your fellow police officer, for $2 million?
That is correct. They waited until the last minute, and then they decided to settle. And I personally believe that's because they did not want me getting on the stand and telling everything that I know about how the operation within the police department really works. And they didn't want that on public record. So they would rather settle than have me expose all of their dirty laundry in a courtroom.
How much money were you talking about, by the way, when it came to what these officers were doing?
Oh, you know, we'll never have a final count, but, you know, the range varied. We got information that some of the drug lines would pay a couple $1,000s a week. We had several sources say that one of the biggest dope lines that was run in the city of Chicago was named Obama, and they would pay as much as $50,000. So it depended on the drug dealer, the amount of money they were bringing in, the amount of protection that they would need, how many locations they were running would vary. It was really a criminal enterprise. It was a complete business, a criminal business.
Has anyone been prosecuted?
Ronald Watts, Sergeant Ronald Watts, and Khalat Muhammad pled guilty, and they served their sentences in federal prison. I believe it was 18 and 22 months. Sergeant Ronald Watts doing 22 months, and I believe Khalat Muhammad did 18 months.
And Jamie Calvin, you were interviewing these officers off and on for several years before you actually were able to the Intercept story came out. Could you talk about the difficulties in getting this story out?
Yeah, so this is a complicated story for a journalist to figure out how to bring to the public. You know, when an Edward Snowden comes to us with a treasure trove of documents, we know what to do with that sort of whistleblower. When somebody like Shannon and her partner Danny come with a compelling story that they have, that's cost them, and they've taken great risks to tell, but by the nature of the story, it can't be fully corroborated. You can't, you know, double source. Other people who were in the room for various conversations won't talk to you. And it's fundamentally a story about the Code of Silence, which we should really call by its true name, which is official lying, concerted, sustained lying by high officials. You know, the question of how to tell that story in a way that is consistent with journalistic ethics and standards of rigor and care, you know, I struggled with that and found ultimately with The Intercept a great, you know, partner in bringing this story out. And where the story sort of ends, and I urge people to go to the Intercept site and read it. It really, you know, partly because of Shannon's great storytelling ability, it reads like a novel. But it ends at a point where I want to leave the reader with a question, which is, if Shannon and Danny are telling the truth, and you've read this long story, you can make your own judgments about credibility. If they are telling the truth, then a whole array of high officials are lying, and lying in concert. So the story really ultimately hinges on arriving at that question, and that question remains open for the city of Chicago. You know, the settlement of the case did not resolve the issue of Shannon's case, did not resolve the issues raised by the case. And what we hope to do through the reporting and ongoing reporting about this is to keep those issues very centrally in the public eye.
Very quickly, late last year, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel apologized for Laquan McDonald's death. In his speech to the Chicago City Council, Emanuel broke with the city's long history of denying the existence of the Code of Silence.
As we move forward, I am looking for a new leader of the Chicago Police Department to address the problems at the very heart of the policing profession. The problem is sometimes referred to as the thin blue line. The problem is other times referred to as the Code of Silence. It is this tendency to ignore. It is a tendency to deny. It is a tendency, in some cases, to cover up the bad actions of a colleague or colleagues. No officer should be allowed to behave as if they are above the law just because they are responsible for upholding the law. Permitting and protecting even the smallest acts of abuse by a tiny fraction of our officers leads to a culture where extreme acts of abuse are more likely, just like what happened to Laquan McDonald.
This comes as Thursday marked the second anniversary of the death of Laquan McDonald, fatally shot by Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke in 2014. Jamie Calvin, you were the first to report the existence of the video of the shooting, which was released 400 days after McDonald was killed, released after Mayor Rahm Emanuel was reelected. As we wrap up, can you talk about the significance of here he's acknowledging the Code of Silence and what this case has meant for the city? Basically, Laquan McDonald shot 16 times. That's almost one bullet for every year of his life. He died at the age of 17.
No, it's an extraordinary moment for the city, and I've now compared the public narrative of Laquan McDonald to the story of Emmett Till, another child of Chicago, that so illuminated the underlying violence of the Jim Crow era. The revelations about Laquan McDonald, not simply the atrocity of his death, but the institutional response after, which is really a classic illustration of the Code of Silence as control of the narrative. You know, the suppression of evidence, the intimidation of witnesses, fabrication of reports. That now has become a sort of framing narrative in Chicago and caused a political earthquake, changed the landscape of the city. So we have, amid all of the sort of bad news and all the disclosures of wrongdoing and corruption within the department, I think it's important to emphasize that as a consequence of the McDonald tragedy, there's an historic opening in Chicago for really meaningful police reform. The language quoted from the mayor, that was one of the mayor's better moments, acknowledging the existence of the Code of Silence. And so there really is going forward, I believe, a kind of irresistible momentum towards reform. But it's a big challenge. It's going to be a long slog, and only by addressing the culture within the department that we refer to as the Code of Silence will change, really be meaningful and endure. We can make all sorts of changes in institutions, tweak procedures, but culture will always trump procedure.
Jamie Calvin, we want to thank you for being with us. We will link to your series, Code of Silence, at democracynow.org. And Shannon Spalding, thank you for your bravery and for speaking out here today on Democracy Now!, former Chicago police officer, whistleblower, featured in the series. She says she suffered retaliation for reporting and investigating criminal activity by fellow Chicago officers. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Sean King joins us to talk about many issues. Stay with us.
Maybe I'm foolish, maybe I'm blind, thinking I can see through.
On Monday, Chicago's City Council Finance Committee approved a settlement of $2 million to 2 police officers that were the targets of extensive and widespread retaliation after they exposed corruption within the police department. Shannon Spalding and Daniel Echeverria had gone to the FBI back in 2007 after they were told by superiors to ignore illegal activity by Ronald Watts, a sergeant with the Chicago Police Department. After Watts was convicted of extorting drug dealers and sentenced to prison, Spalding and Echeverria became targeted for retaliation throughout the department. This included threats of physical violence against them, ostracization, and overt attempts to ruin their careers. According to their accounts of the retaliation they experienced, it's almost as if the few bad apples were the ones running the entire police department and somehow outnumbered all of the good cops we hear so much about. Via the Chicago Sun-Times, Spalding and Echeverria allege they were retaliated against for helping to expose police corruption nearly a decade ago. The partners had alleged their superiors told them in 2007 to ignore evidence of criminal wrongdoing by Sergeant Ronald Watts. Instead, on personal time, they said they reported it to the FBI. What the officers thought would end with a simple meeting eventually turned into Operation Brass Tacks. And while they tried to limit their involvement in the investigation to personal time, it became so time-consuming that the officers were forced to tell CPD's internal affairs. As a result, they were formally detailed to the FBI. Spalding and Echeverria spent 2 years working exclusively on the Watts investigation. Watts was sentenced in October 2013 to 22 months in prison for shaking down drug dealers. But lawyers for the 2 officers say Internal Affairs Chief Juan Rivera blew their cover. Spalding and Echeverria were branded rat mother and told their bosses didn't want them in their units. They were allegedly told their careers were over, given undesirable assignments and shifts, and told fellow officers wouldn't back them up. Their actions allegedly made the brass so angry that Spalding was warned to wear her vest so she wouldn't be shot in the parking lot for crossing the thin blue line. One of the defendants, charged with some of the retaliatory conduct, resigned in December of 2015 before the police department initiated disciplinary proceedings against him for his role in the reinvestigation of the David Koshman case. First Deputy Corporation Counsel Jenny Knotts told Alderman Monday. Also in 2015, a key CPD witness who would have rebutted some of the plaintiffs' most serious allegations of retaliation relating to their experiences in the narcotic unit was indicted on felony perjury charges relating to testimony that he gave in another case. The police superintendent recommended in March that this officer be terminated. Knotts added, the plaintiffs would certainly, if this case went to trial, use these recent developments to attack the credibility of 2 of the defense's key witnesses at trial, making this case difficult to win. The settlement was reached 1 day before Mayor Rahm Emanuel would have been forced to testify at their civil trial. This has spurred speculation that the settlement was really intended to keep Emanuel from having to testify about a code of silence within the CPD, that he has already publicly acknowledged.